Spencer Hayes, it's good to see you.
Likewise, great to finally meet. It looks like the technology gods have smiled upon us finally.
That's right. We've been having some back and forth issues, and some mostly due to stupid mistakes on my part. Given that you are in China, when you say to me, "Hey, your 7 o'clock is my morning, so why don't we talk PM is my morning, so why don't we talk then?" It did not occur to me that means that I have to call you the day before. And so I just totally blew it. And then we had technical issues the second time, but now third time's a charm. This is the Sophia program. Welcome to everyone in the Sophia audience. meaningoflife.tv, bloggingheads.tv. The Sophia is available on streaming video and audio podcast. I'm Daniel Kaufman, professor of philosophy at Missouri State University, and I'm very pleased to be joined by Spencer Case. Spencer, why don't you just give a little bit about yourself to people, your background, what brings you to China, so on and so forth.
Sure. Well, I'm currently an international research fellow at Wuhan University in Wuhan, China. This is a city I hadn't heard of before I applied for this gig last year, or I guess it was even earlier this year. It's got a city of 10 million people. There are all kinds of cities of many million people in China that I've never heard of. It's incredible.
Yeah, that's amazing.
Everything is like an order of magnitude larger over here, it seems.
That's like the size of Los Angeles. I mean, that's crazy.
Somebody told me, like, "Oh, I'm from a small town." And I'm like, "How many people live in it?" She's like, 2 million. Like, that's larger than the capital of any state I've lived in. It's insane. Anyway, before that, let's see, last year I got my PhD in philosophy from the University of Colorado Boulder. And my dissertation defends moral realism. I'm interested in meta-ethics. Let's see, what else beyond that might you want to know? Go ahead.
We'll have to talk about meta-ethics sometime, because that's something I'm big on, and I'm definitely not a moral realist. So there's plenty of stuff for us to have good arguments about. So you did your PhD at UC Boulder, and so you're in China. Did you go on the full-blown job market, or are you doing this first? In other words, is this something you're doing because the job market didn't work out, or are you sort of doing this before you go on the job market?
I kind of think this is the job market working out. I have a writing-only job for 2 years. I call that working out.
Well, I wasn't meaning to denigrate what you got. I meant more meanings looking for tenure-track positions that, will allow you to...
I looked for tenure-track positions. I didn't get one, but I kind of wanted to do a postdoc anyway, right? If I had gotten some tenure-track position at a school that wasn't amazing, I'd kind of feel compelled to take it, but I'd rather do a postdoc and then get a tenure-track job. So,
at a place that's amazing.
Yeah, or wherever I can get it at, yeah.
Yeah, it's funny because I felt when I got my PhD in 1999, and I also thought I want a job at an amazing place. And then the job at Missouri State was offered to me, and I thought to myself, well, I better take this, because I knew people who held out and wound up with nothing, with zip.
Yeah,
so I better take this, but while I'm there, I'll just keep publishing and I'll just keep sending out applications, which I did. And up until I got tenure. And now that I'm at the end of my career, or late in my career, but pretty relatively close to the end, at least of the professor part, looking back on it now, I'm actually glad I didn't get a job at an amazing place, because I would not have had the freedom that I have. I would not be doing this program. I would not be doing all the public intellectual work I've been doing. I would have not been able to work in any area other than the area they hired me in. And it's just, I think that people wildly overestimate how good those jobs are, and wildly underestimate how good jobs at relatively no-name places are, just because your freedom is just absurd, right? I mean, it's just, and from the very day one, we only have 5 faculty. from you get hired from day one. You're an active member in everything. You are involved in all the decision making. You are involved, and so there's just a lot to be said for it. Anyway, I didn't mean to go off on a
No, I get it, and I could add to that. My undergrad institution is Idaho State University, which I think doesn't even have a philosophy department. It's a program lumped in with English, and I've got to say, I'm really glad I went there, and I'm actually think I got a better education out of that than I would have had I gone to some big place, because I had all of this access to the professors.
That's right.
A lot of them are still my friends today, and it's been a really good experience. And I don't have any kind of jealousy or anything towards somebody who gets into like Harvard or something like that. Good for you. But these lesser known schools can also work out for people. It worked out for me. Sounds like your job's working out for you.
Oh, absolutely. And because I've had so much freedom and been able to do all this public intellectual work, that's how I meet people like you. I mean, I met you through freaking Twitter, right? I mean, through social media, and the only reason I'm on social media is because I'm engaged in public intellectual work, which I then promote on the social media platforms. I would not have a Twitter account otherwise. And so there's all sorts of people I would never meet. So Spencer and I, we met. I don't even remember what discussion we met in the middle of. There was something. Was it something Massimo was arguing about with somebody, or I don't remember what.
I've seen you pop up in threads I've been in a few times. A few months ago, there was one about my last article for Quillette.
Which article was that?
It was Beyond the Hypatia Affair, Philosophers Blocking the Way of Inquiry. She popped up briefly in a thread there. I think we've had some previous interactions, but I don't recall what they were.
And then we probably have. So Spencer and I started talking to each other. We sort of privately, and I said, "Hey, why don't we do a discussion? Why don't we talk to each other on Blogging Heads?" I'm trying to keep bringing more people in. I've started doing talks with Robert Gressis. I've been doing talks with Crispin Sartwell. Originally the show was just me and Massimo, and we did it for years. And then he sort of became a big shot and has less time. But also, you just run out of shit to talk with after a while, because you've kind of used up all each other's expertise. So I'm always looking for new people, and we had a nice exchange, and I thought, hey, let's try this. So Spencer and I are going to talk about a bunch of things to do with philosophy, generally speaking. How we think of it as a discipline, as a subject, whether there's a difference. But one of the arguments that on Twitter that Massimo was just involved in recently, that I jumped in on for a brief while, that then led to me doing a dialogue with him on the subject, had to do with whether or not there's a fundamental difference between, philosophy as a profession and then philosophy maybe as it's done more generally, which is something Spencer also is interested that we might talk about, certain things that we're worried about and so on and so forth and so on. So it'll be somewhat freewheeling. Do you want to maybe say a little bit about how you think of philosophy, what attracted you to it, why you went into it, get us started?
Yeah. So how I got into it. You read my essay, Bearing Witness, about my leaving the Mormon Church.
Yeah. So I read the essay. Spencer wrote and we're going to have links to all of these things. Spencer wrote a really outstanding essay for Quillette. Was it Quillette?
It was Quillette. Yeah.
About his journey to philosophy and out of Mormonism. But I'm going to ask you to give your little summary of it, because people may not have read it. I've read it, but people may not have read it. Maybe you can give a brief summary of the journey, because you're going to tell us now about how you got into philosophy, and it is related to your leaving Mormonism.
Sure is. That's
so
right.
Just give us a short.
So I'll just say that for me, I mean, there are different entry points into philosophy. I think for some people, this is just, they like puzzles or things like that. Like maybe Raymond Smullyan is somebody like this, where they just have an interest in solving puzzles. And I'm not really into that sort of thing. I get frustrated by that, those sorts of activities. But for me, I got into philosophy. It sort of emerged from my own concerns about my life and what is it I'm supposed to believe? How is it I'm supposed to live my life? And I didn't think of this as philosophy, right? I'd never heard of philosophy when I was a kid, but in retrospect, it seems I want to project some kind of teleology on my experiences. I mean, I grew up in an LDS home, Mormon home, not fundamentalist Mormon. Some people think I mean that. No, nothing like that. Just the mainstream LDS church. And both my mom and my dad and my three siblings are, very religious, believing Mormons. And I struggled with this, right? You're supposed to bear your testimony at a certain point, right? Which is you go before the congregation. It's usually on fast and testimony meeting, which is set aside for this, but other times too. And you just say, typically I know the church is true. I know that Joseph Smith was a prophet. I know that, I guess it'd be Russell M. Nielsen today. I know Russell M. Nielsen is a prophet. But I never could feel like I knew this stuff. And
what do you think the point of that sort of public display is? Now in hindsight, looking back on it, aside from whatever the stated purpose is, what do you think is the actual point of having people have to stand up and do that sort of thing?
Well, I mean, don't you think that, like, if you, even as philosophers, we do this to a degree, right? Like if you have some intuition and you want to test it out and you hear it confirmed by somebody you trust, maybe your credence goes up a little bit, right? Maybe.
So you think mostly serves the purpose of kind of social positioning within the organization?
I don't know about social positioning. I think it can increase your confidence to hear your beliefs affirmed by others. And
because reading it to me, look, I come out of a Jewish family.
Yeah.
We do nothing like that.
Yeah.
And to me, it sounded creepy and manipulative, to be honest, as a practice. It seemed to me like a kind of very psychologically manipulative thing to do, to make somebody do. It seems to me, at least as a person looking entirely from the outside, the point of it is to kind of ensure a kind of conformity, not just in behavior, but in here, that I find invasive. Nobody in a Jewish synagogue, even an Orthodox one, is going to interrogate what you believe. They're going to just look at what you do.
Right.
And so I guess I found it, what you described in that essay, I found it very powerful, but I found it powerful in a kind of a creepy and manipulative sort of way. Do you not view it in a negative? Do you not think it has a sort of a negative purpose?
Yeah, I do.
I'm certainly not trying to convince you. I'm just asking as an outsider.
I do. But I mean, I should say, this is my perspective on this, and there'll be other people who have different experiences.
Yeah, of course.
You shouldn't take take this to be, the final word on the matter.
Yeah.
But yeah, it felt that way. It felt that way to me, and I especially hated the saying that I heard it numerous times, that a testimony comes in bearing it, which is to say, like, if you'll just say something in front of a bunch of people, you'll come to believe it. Now, as a psychological principle, I think that's true, but I think it's an epistemic disaster.
It's true in a scary way. It's sort of, yeah.
It's true. And I see some applications of that to other things, like the danger of virtue signaling, the danger of just saying something, perhaps sincerely, perhaps not, as a way of achieving social status, because that has an effect on your beliefs that may or may not have anything to do with what's true.
Yeah. And we may come to this philosophy is not free of this sort of thing, especially not today. And so, which we'll come to later when we're talking about the things we're worried about. So what was the relationship between the sort of the coming out of Mormonism and the going into philosophy and the interest in philosophy? Was it the sort of the epistemic realization you had about, hey, this is a really odd thing to ask somebody to do, especially when they told you that they don't have the relevant belief and you're just telling them to go ahead and say it anyway and eventually you'll have it? Was there something in there that sort of stirred interest in sort of epistemic style?
Yeah, I mean, I just had this feeling that my mind was just running up against this principle, which is that you shouldn't tell somebody you believe something in order to believe it, right? Like, I should be concerned with getting my own beliefs right first and then telling other people what I've come to. And I just felt like my mind had snagged on a protruding bit of reality there. And I wanted to find some way to sort of fix my beliefs in a way that was free of that kind of manipulation. Now, maybe that's not even possible, but I want to at least make an effort.
Sure.
And that's really what led me into philosophy, is I sort of saw a philosophy as, the community of philosophers. At the time, this would have been late teens, early 20s, I saw well, here's an effort to use reason as a way of sort of fixing beliefs about these important things. What should we believe? How should we live? And so I think it's even fair to say that it sort of took the place of religion in my life and still does.
Although not in the sense of replacing the dogmatic dimension of it, right?
Hopefully not.
Yeah, but the reason I ask is this will also probably come up in a little bit, but one interesting question with regard to what philosophy is and what its purpose is it the purpose of philosophy ultimately to arrive at positions? And I'm not so sure that I think it is, despite the fact that plenty of people do. And obviously a dogma is just a sort of a certain kind of heavily entrenched and enforced position. But were you looking for philosophy to give you sort of positions, views on things, or did you think of it more as a tool set?
No, I wanted positions. I wanted to find some sort of bedrock on a foundation or something like that, for sure. I don't think I'd put it quite the same way today, but I think maybe I'm slightly more optimistic than you are about philosophy and progress and things. And I'll even make this point, which is that even if it turns out you don't think, well, suppose it's moral realism and moral anti-realism, and you just think, well, I just don't know how this can be resolved or something. Well, that's a discovery, isn't it? I mean, that's positive knowledge. You found out that there's this intractable issue, and the people who are, banging their hands on the table and insisting it's one way or it's the other, and we know this, both those people are wrong. So I think that is knowledge, isn't it? That is.
Yeah. I mean, it is knowledge of a kind. I guess what's interesting to me isn't just that it may be that many philosophical issues ultimately suffer from kind of indeterminacy, but even more interesting to me is the fact that it doesn't really matter in many cases with many of these theories which theory is true. In other words, it has no practical implication even for science whether realism or anti-realism is true. I mean, I just had this discussion with Masim. I mean, there's nothing that prevents a physicist from being a Berkeleyan, right? And so what I'm also somewhat interested in is, okay, well then what kind of thing is philosophy doing if it's indeterminate, and even if it isn't, if it's has no sort of concrete or impact on practice. Now, this is obviously not true for all philosophy. Obviously, in the case of normative ethics, it wouldn't be true. but in a lot of areas of philosophy, I think it is. Then I think it raises a very interesting question. Well, then what on earth is this thing we're doing? I have my own sort of views on that, which are developing. But that's where I think some of the really interesting territory lies, is in the not in the none of them are true, but it doesn't matter which one of them is true in a certain sense. That to me is interesting. But I don't know how you feel about that.
Well, so I do disagree about moral realism or anti-realism, that not being of any practical significance. There are different ways of cashing out this distinction between where does normative ethics begin and where does metaethics, or where does normative ethics begin and metaethics end. I tend to think of metaethics as being just very abstract questions about ethics, not, questions that concern this other autonomous enterprise of normative ethics or something like that. Let's see, my friend Joshua Blanchard has got a paper on angsty realism that's quite interesting. I commented it at the Rocky Mountain Ethics Congress in, I believe, 2017, where he explores the significance of why it is certain views matter to us. It is interesting and puzzling, and maybe we want to say it has a certain spiritual significance, or it shapes our fundamental outlook on reality or something like that. I think there are practical reasons why it matters whether moral realism is correct or not.
Yeah, I should be clear. When I said that I didn't mean moral realism or anti-realism. It doesn't matter. I meant metaphysical anti-realism or realism doesn't matter. That's why I said there's nothing that stops a physicist from being a Berkeleyan.
I see that.
I agree with you. In the case of ethics, what I've just said is not the case. And I don't want to give the impression that I think that all of philosophy is like this, but I do think that some of the most fundamental, longest-lasting philosophical questions / subject are of this character. I don't think, for example, in epistemology, at the end of the day, there's going to be any the question of whether justifications are internal or external. I don't think has an answer. I think that is fundamentally indeterminate. And I think a lot of it comes down to sort of, what you're engaged in the inquiry for, what the relevant interests are involved when you're engaged in it. I'm very Wittgensteinian about a lot of these things. One thing I know I'm absolutely certain of is that the sort of very standard mainline rationalistic, small r rationalistic tradition that runs from Plato all the way up through, let's say, I want to say the logical positivists, is fundamentally mistaken about the subject, about the nature of the subject. And I wrote this long piece a while ago. I published this long piece in the journal Philosophy, the one that's published by the Royal Institute of Philosophy in Britain, just called Knowledge, Wisdom, and the Philosopher. And I actually sort of said that the whole history of philosophy can be broken up into two major traditions, a sort of a mainline tradition, and then what I call the kind of a counterculture, which runs from Aristotle through Hume to the later Wittgenstein to the ordinary language philosophers and the like. And I throw in my lot with the counterculture, fully understanding that it probably is never going to be the dominant strain, but I think that that's partly because of professional imperatives that have nothing to do with the actual validity of the discipline. Philosophers in the current professional disciplinary environment are simply never going to, as a whole, embrace a view according to which there should be a lot less philosophy, right? Just like social workers are never going to really want poverty to end, or because then you're out of a job, right? If Wittgenstein's right, then half of you, there's no reason for you to be doing anything or doing what you're doing. And so I thought I think that was always going to be sort of doomed because of the disciplinary professional imperatives. But I take it you belong. You view yourself as belonging to what I'm calling the mainline tradition. If you're a moral realist, and I'm assuming you are you some sort of epistemic foundationalist, or?
Trying to figure that out right now. I think so. Yeah, I think I'm a foundationalist.
Yeah. It's probably unfair to ask you all this, given that you're sort of at the beginning and I'm relatively nearing the end. It's probably unfair to ask you for your settled views on all these things, given that you're just sort of getting started.
One brief point.
Yeah,
though.
please say whatever you want. I'm just going to stick loosely to that.
So I think it's easy to take some particular view, like mereology. This seems like a paradigmatic case. Like, what's the relationship between parts and wholes? That seems pretty irrelevant to practical concerns. But you take specific ethical issues and you think them through far enough, and suddenly you start seeing all sorts of really abstract metaphysical and epistemic questions becoming relevant, right? Like, for example, mereology seems like maybe it's got something to say about the existence of persons over time, right? And lots of ethical questions hang on this, right? So if you, for example, abortion, you might want to know, like, when do you have like a new being? You've got a sperm and you've got an egg, and then they combine. And at what point is there something where I can say, I was once that thing? Suddenly, questions about the unities of things that are made up of parts seem kind of relevant here. So I'm just putting that forward to say, like, as an example, you never know when some of these really abstract questions might be discovered to have practical bearing on something that's important.
Yeah. No, listen. I intone more confidently than I actually am. I mean, I always try to present whatever I think at the time is sort of in the strongest possible version, the strongest possible light. But I'm really very hesitant about everything, right? I mean, the older I get, the more hesitant I get about everything. And the less convinced I am. I mean, I've pretty much completely changed. My views have changed completely from when I first entered the profession. When I first went into the profession, I was a hardcore rationalist. I was a Platonist. I was a Kantian. I mean, I had all of these sort of, and in many ways, those positions suited a more youthful and idealistic and maybe self-righteous temperament. I've just found that as I've gotten older, I would attribute my shift in philosophical views far more to the changing of my temperament as a result of aging and participating in adult forms of life than I would attribute it to any philosophical arguments.
You've used a word that I think is really important and neglected in this whole topic, which is temperament, which is we tend to think of conflicting intuitions. That's discussed a lot. But I think conflicting philosophical temperaments play a huge role in what views people end up with.
I agree.
And one of the major questions here, like, for example, I think tolerance for mystery, right? Tolerance for mystery. Like, I admit that there's a certain amount of mysteriousness involved in thinking that there are moral facts that we can't see or empirically observe, really. And how is it that they interact with our minds? There are some real puzzles here. But if you're like me, and you're like a lot of people, you'll have a temperament where, well, look, it seems like there are certain things that are just wrong, and I'm willing to tolerate a certain amount of mystery and weirdness, if you will, in order to make good on that. But then there are other people like me who are willing to tolerate what seems to me a whole lot more mystery than me, and they'll go with like skeptical theism. And yeah, it's weird that this, completely all good, all loving, all knowing God would allow all these horrible things to happen. But I feel God's presence in my life, and I guess that has to be the case. And so, whereas you go to the other end of the spectrum, and you've got hard-nosed empiricists and the like, where there's very little tolerance for anything that can't be nailed down. And I really think these temperaments tend to shape what views people end up with.
I agree with you. I mean,
Nicholas Rescher has this really interesting analogy of philosophy as an arms race. So like we start off with our temperaments. I don't know if he uses the word temperaments here, but I'm using it here. So we start off with our temperaments, and maybe I'm realist, you're anti-realist, and you come up with, Mackey's queerness argument, and I come back with something else. And we just keep getting more and more levels of logical sophistication. But it seems like the actual undercurrent that's pushing us towards our various positions are these temperaments where I have a greater tolerance for mystery than you have, perhaps.
Yeah. I know. I listen. I've been thinking this now for quite some time, and it's a hard thing to sell, though. I mean, the way that people in philosophy, especially in the politically charged areas, the way that they pursue the various questions and stuff is with a sort of ferocity that I just have very difficult time understanding in light of the nature of the subject matter, and given how unlikely it is that your certainty can possibly be that easily attained, right? I mean, I don't understand anyone who lacks healthy self-hesitation, healthy skepticism, self-doubt in this discipline. It's not as if you're doing chemistry, right? I mean, I don't understand the kind of certitude that will lead people to engage in the business that they're doing with the kind of ferocity that people in our discipline do. And it only can come from a predisposition or a temperament. It can't possibly be from the subject itself or from its literature, because if you read that literature, you'd have to see that there's plenty of smart, well-educated non-Nazis who don't agree with you. All right. You know what I mean? And that matters. It means that you shouldn't be so sure. Right. But I just don't see any of that. At least not in the charged areas, but I have to say, even in the non-charged areas, the non-politically charged areas, I couldn't believe when I was in graduate school some of the sort of the knife fights, the proverbial knife fights between people over shit like the reference of an indexical, or about, compositional semantics. I mean, people stopped being friends with each other for like 30 years over these sorts of things. I don't understand it in general, but I especially don't understand it in philosophy.
One example of that, in like a whole lot of certainty in a non-charged area. I laughed out loud when I read this. I do cite this in my paper, and I think I had the self-restraint not to comment on it in a snarky way. But it's the Coney and Feldman 2011 book Evidentialism. In the introduction, they began working on evidentialism when they were astonished to discover that some philosophers do not accept it. They say something that's almost a verbatim quote. They're like we, and then they even say, we remain amazed to this day. Like,
amazed.
Some philosophers just don't accept our view of epistemic justification. How could this be?
I find it very strange, but I guess that does depend to a certain extent on what you take philosophy to be. And so, given how in light of how you came into it, and sort of with some sense of some of the, at least the positions, places you find yourself in on the position map, if you want to call it, how are you inclined to describe philosophy at this point in your life? How would you characterize it as a discipline, as a subject?
Yeah, fair enough. When I was in the Army, I didn't mention this, I think, in my introduction. But
please add a little bio if you need to. Yeah,
I was in Iraq and Afghanistan. I had 2 deployments, and I would write for Army newspapers. That was my job: take pictures and write.
Oh, so you were an internal journalist.
Yeah.
Wow, fascinating.
Well,
fascinating.
More propagandist than journalist.
No, sure, I understand.
I got in trouble because I kept wanting to say more than they wanted me to say, and it was mostly for that reason that I left when my contract expired. Anyway, I would remember, my second deployment, I was actually a graduate student. They pulled me out of graduate school to send me to participate in the Afghanistan surge. And so people would say, well, you're in the reserve. What do you do as a civilian? I'm like, I'm a philosophy graduate student. And they would always say, like, so what's your philosophy? And or like, what are some of your wise sayings? And I'm like, I don't know. Don't piss in the wind. I mean, I don't know. Like, I'm supposed to like, but this is like sort of in as much as there is a stereotype of philosophers, in as much as there's enough public awareness of what philosophy is for there to be a stereotype, it's like a philosopher is someone who just like will dispense nuggets of wisdom, on demand or something like that. Or what's your philosophy? And I'm supposed to give this wrapped up in a bow sort of package, like, there you go. And I never really was able to give a real satisfying answer to what is your philosophy, like in a word or something.
That's just because you don't have one. I mean, I think most people, when they hear philosopher, they think of what I would normally think of as like a mystic or a sage, right?
Yeah.
I don't think that they think of it as some, I don't even if they might have read a Socratic dialogue, in high school or something, I'm not sure that they make that connection. You know what I mean? And I don't even know if I love saying I'm a philosopher.
No, I agree.
I am a philosophy professor.
Yeah, that's fair.
But, well, this is something that I kind of argued with Massimo about. But anyway, so keep going. So you were never able to answer the question, what's your philosophy?
Not satisfying in a satisfying way. At the end, I would give a kind of sketch of moral realism or whatever. But I think I'm able to say a little bit more about the value of philosophy. Somebody asked me, I think I'd like to study philosophy, but I think I would come out with more questions than answers. And I said, yeah, but they'd be better questions. I think that's an improvement on my prior attempts to answer this kind of query. So, but if I were to say, like, what is philosophy? Of course, from teaching Platonic dialogues that to give necessary and sufficient conditions for any interesting term, it's a dicey endeavor, right? You're not likely to meet success.
No.
But I would say philosophy is inquiry into certain kinds of questions that cannot be, at least can't obviously be resolved empirically, or cannot obviously be resolved by any known method. And investigating those questions by pure reason in some sense. And what else can we say about it? Maybe that's it. But then specifying what kinds of questions there are. I was thinking about this before coming on. Ultimate questions, I've sometimes said, but it's hard to say what I mean by ultimate questions without defining it in a way that's circular or uninformative.
And just leaving it that way wouldn't disambiguate it from religion, right? I mean, or theology. And so, when people ask me the question, I tell them I don't think that it's answerable. What I'll do is I'll sort of say a bunch of things that will give them a sense of what we do. But I never really try to give a formulation because I don't think there is one. So what I'll often do is simply, I have sort of a mental list of let's say 10 or 15 very representative philosophical questions.
Yeah.
That I'll just lay out. And usually that alone is enough to get people to a sense of what the subject's about. I will sometimes talk about what I take to be philosophy's distinctive tool set. And that's what I would call logical analysis as well as linguistic analysis, whether at the syntactic, the grammatical level, or the pragmatic level. If I was a continental philosopher, I might talk something about sort of the method of phenomenology, the sort of the distinctive way of which you go around sort of engaging in analysis of the first person. But more than that, I really wouldn't say. I mean, it's sort of because I don't think that there is I don't think there is a defining characteristic. even worse than that, I'm not even sure I think that there's a sort of a family resemblance account you can give. I know, I hear what you're saying about sort of ultimate questions or fundamental questions, but a lot of times that's not what it's about at all. I don't take the reference of an indexical to be a fundamental question.
No,
I spent 3 years in graduate school studying that.
Yeah, but what about the nature of meaning, right? The nature of meaning. So you take some big question and then you zoom into some little tiny detail of it, and then it doesn't seem like an ultimate question.
So in my list, I would say, how do marks on pieces of paper and stuff have meanings, right? Or truth, semantic properties. Yes, that would be sort of a question that I would include in a list of philosophical questions. But do you think it's a bit more tightly definable? I mean, obviously you don't think it's definable in necessarily sufficient conditions, but do you think it's more definable than I think it is?
It seems like it, right? It seems like it. Like there are certain questions that seem to resist, they seem to continue to inspire puzzlement and wonder, and often characteristically you can find some connection to things that are of ultimate significance, right? So even if you got questions that themselves, like about the nature of indexicals or something, that don't seem of ultimate significance, you can trace it back to things that do. So I tend to think you can make sense of it as a sort of unified enterprise. I think the more interesting question is what do we think we're going to get out of it, right? What's the value of doing it? And I'd like to hear your take on that.
God, I was going to say that if I was to be pushed to give more of a formulation, I probably would give something along the lines that Wilfred Sellers gives in his paper on the scientific and manifest images. And actually, in the discussion I just had with Massimo, I said that more and more it seems to me that philosophers are sort of the ringleaders in the manifest image, right? I mean, what we do is sort of try to show at the most general level how all the different subject areas and question areas sort of relate to one another. In what then becomes a sort of a whole narrative, because of course one of the things that distinguishes the manifest image from the scientific image is that the manifest images has a sort of a narrational quality to it. If all you had with the scientific image and you just had machines doing science, it would just all be statistics, right? What we do is we always want to sort of interpret things in light of a kind of a narrative that makes a kind of sense that then ties to things that are normative, that ties to things having to do with significance and meaning and stuff like that. And so if I was pushed, I would give a sort of a Salarzian account of philosophy. And I raise that only because of what you just asked me, which is what I think we seek to get out of it. I have much humbler ambitions for philosophy now than I would have had when I started out. I don't think ultimately its purpose is to discover the truth. I don't think ultimately its purpose is to determine the good, the true, or the beautiful, right? I mean, I think ultimately its purpose is just to provide us with a set of tools by which to examine sort of perennial questions, the ultimate purpose of which is just to get better at things, but not to come upon any solutions, any final answers, it's, I think, rare that a philosophy leads to a very tangible, one of the areas in which I think it did, which you could argue it really had a very directly tangible effect, is in the area of politics, right? So, philosophy's relationship to the emergence of modern liberal democracies in the West is one of the more potent, direct, substantial influences it's had. I think that's the exception rather than the rule. And even there, I would argue that all sorts of non-philosophical forces probably had a lot more to do with it. than philosophy. I think we can overestimate how much philosophy had to do with it. So I don't know if that's any sort of answer, but.
Well, I would also add to things where I think there's been philosophical influence, and I would even call it progress, is in ethics, where it's not like here are a list of perennial questions that we've solved once and for all. I don't think that kind of progress we've made, or should even aspire to. But I think with the idea of like an expanding moral circle, they see a trajectory towards, other people have interests that have well-beings that matter. You need to give them a certain amount of moral consideration. You can see like that didn't really exist, or at least I didn't find it at all evident in like Homer, right? Where it's just loyalty and the people who are your friends you should be good to and destroy your enemies.
But is it your impression that the fact of the expanding moral circle in at least developed nations is primarily or even largely the result of philosophical efforts?
I wouldn't say primarily. I mean, you had
even largely.
I think largely. Yeah, I think largely. I think you can trace a thread of. Yeah, I mean, I think that's true. I think you see some of this in Book One of the Republic, where Socrates is made to say, made to push the line that you should care even about the well-being of your enemies, or you should at least not want them to become worse. You should not want to harm them, or at least a wise person would not want to harm even his enemies. And that seems like a step beyond Homer. Now you've got this Christianity and all of these other things that happen, but I do think that reason plays some role here, and it plays some role in we recognize other people being moral subjects and deserving of our concern. We recognize that, like the people who've been enslaved, we can't just treat them any way we want. And it's, of course, possible, and maybe perhaps an anti-realist would want to just explain all of that away in terms of purely social forces. But I suppose if you already accept moral realism or give it higher credence, you'd be more inclined to see reason itself being an influence here.
Yeah.
But I don't think it's a good idea to go into philosophy with some practical goal in mind, right? I think there are good things that come of us getting into philosophy, but I think they have to be indirect, right? We have to just sort of do this inquiry for its own sake, and not aim directly at some way we want to make the world better.
It's interesting. There's so many things to unpack here, and things that I'm really not sure about. I mean, so one thing is the efficacy of moral philosophy, so I'm not going to deny that there's moral progress. Indeed, I think that's obvious, right? I mean, and indeed, oftentimes what frustrates me the most about my political compatriots over on the Democratic side of American politics is that they're acting like no moral progress has been made at all, or that things are actually worse, which either is just cynical and disingenuous, or means you just don't know any history, and don't know any recent history. But in terms, moral progress to me is a no-brainer. We're making it, right? But the question of the role of philosophy in that, I'm much more skeptical about. Peter Singer, who, if you're going to give any example of a philosopher where you'd want to connect their philosophical work to very practical developments or progress on the ground, it would be someone like Singer, who is given credit for at least two major
I know what you're going to say.
Moral movements, both the effective altruist and the animal welfare movements. But Singer himself will tell you that one factory farming video will have way more effect on a person's behavior than his entire corpus, right? he downplays the significance of his own work in terms of actual efficacy of producing moral change on the ground, right? So I'm skeptical about the efficacy of purely intellectual realizations on the sensibility.
Well, I'm a counterexample to this because I heard the arguments and I changed my views in light of the arguments, not because I'd seen any factory farming video. And I think even if you see...
So you became an ethical vegan just on the basis of the arguments?
Yeah. Emotion is it plays an important role in moral progress and these changing paradigms of how, coming to see other people and also animals as moral subjects. Surely emotion plays a large role here. But that doesn't mean that reason doesn't also play a large role here. And I wouldn't want to insist on dichotomizing reason and emotion here. Maybe the two can coincide, right? So,
I don't know if I was making a hard distinction in general. I was simply saying there's a very big. It's very different to present someone with arguments, which is primarily an appeal to their intellect, than it is to sort of appeal to people in ways that are designed primarily to appeal to their emotions and to their sensibility. That's all I was saying. I don't know that I was saying that you can necessarily draw a hard line between the two as a general matter.
No, I didn't mean to attribute that to you. I didn't mean to attribute that to you, but it did sound like you were saying that this is counter evidence to the view that reason plays some role in moral progress, because it seems like emotions are in the driver's seat here. Whereas I want to say, okay, emotions might be in the driver's seat, but let's consider how reason might also be involved here, right? Like, it's not just that you see some moral, some factory farming video and you're disgusted by it, because like a lot, I've heard people say this, right? That like, I don't want to see those factory farming videos because then I would be disgusted and I'd rather just enjoy my meat. You could think of it that way, and people do. Like, in order for you to actually change your behavior, that emotion has to be supported by some kind of reason.
Yeah.
At least it has to be supported by recognizing that you can't rationalize this away, because there are other instances of suffering where you might think, well, maybe this is necessary or what have you. But you've got to recognize, okay, I think I know the sorts of things that might justify inflicting large amounts of suffering. I don't see anything like that present here. Therefore, it looks like my emotion is truth conducive in some way.
Right. Yeah, no, that's a fair point. I will say that I've heard it far more in the other direction. In other words, I've heard multiple times from people, well, I always found the arguments convincing, but I never really actually was enough to sort of motivate me to and then I sort of forced myself to watch one of these horrific videos, and then that's what made the difference. Massimo will tell you that, and I've heard that from other people, but that you are describing that you in your case it worked oppositely. I don't doubt it for a minute. What's interesting is that I've read all the arguments and I've watched the videos, and I still very happily eat meat. And so, and maybe this does speak to sort of the deeper point that we're getting at here. To me, that fact, if I was on the other side, would give me tremendous pause, right? Because I'm simply not willing to simply call everybody a Nazi, right? Right? And because that's typically what will happen, right? So if I'll tell people this, and you just sort of watch them escalate their rhetoric in talking with me, right? First they get frustrated. Then they kind of go through a period of of very, very expressive disbelief. And then ultimately they simply conclude that I'm a terrible person, right? Which just makes me sort of laugh at this point, because at this point I'm old enough to really not give a crap whether people I barely know think I'm a terrible person. How
do you analyze this yourself? What I would want to know.
So I just find it, to me, the fact that other people just as smart as me who've read all the same stuff as me and seen all come to exactly the opposite conclusion, that makes me very skeptical about philosophy, right? Precisely because I'm not inclined to simply dismiss everyone else as being an idiot or evil or whatever. What that does is it makes me ask myself, okay, maybe the thing we're engaged in is not what it looks like at first glance, right? But anyway, go ahead. I'm sorry, you were going to say something.
Yeah, I'd be interested how you yourself diagnose the situation. Do you think that the arguments are not good?
I think a lot of the arguments aren't good. I also just have a very sort of peculiar, maybe peculiar to me sort of view about morality. For one thing, I take a very Susan Wolfish view of it. I don't believe moral considerations are always overriding, nor do I think they should be. Massimo and I have had arguments about this because he's a Stoic and I'm more Aristotelian. And the Stoics obviously think that virtue is the entirety of your flourishing consists of virtue, whereas Aristotle thinks it's only a piece and not even a necessary piece because the life of contemplation is not a life of moral virtue for Aristotle. So for one thing, I just relegate the moral to a much smaller portion of my overall life than the people I find typically I'm engaged with in this sort of an area. So a lot of times the difference between me and the person I'm arguing with simply comes down to the fact that they think certain things are always overriding and I don't, right? Okay,
so I want to just pause and analyze this for a second,
sure.
What you're saying.
Sure, happy to.
So, because I think this goes back to your point about peer disagreement. I've never been so impressed with these arguments for peer disagreement leading to we got to suspend judgment. So the idea is, if you and I are epistemic peers, we're equally smart. We've all read all the same stuff. We have all the same evidence. How is it that I'm able to maintain my own view and you're able to maintain yours, and we don't just sort of each suspend judgment? It sounds like you're maybe gesturing in the direction of the equal weight view. Like I should just see Spencer and Dan as two people in a room who have the same amount of evidence, the same ability to analyze it, who've come to different conclusions. So we should just be neutral on that question or something like that.
No, it doesn't. It's not so much. It's not that at all. I mean, it causes me. It doesn't lead me to think I should suspend judgment or should equal out. It leads me to say, oh, this is obviously a very different kind of question than I thought it was at the beginning. It's not like I don't think there's actually any independent objective fact of the matter, right? So of course we can have incommensurable views about this, right? Because I think that the questions for the most part suffer from indeterminacy. Especially with respect to moral questions. I mean, with regards to moral questions, it seems to me the most obvious. It's less obvious in other areas. But I don't think there's any independent fact of the matter as to these things. And I just think what we're really just talking about are different people with very different priorities in their lives. And I think to a certain extent they're incommensurable. I don't know how to measure myself against one of these people, right?
So the disagreement stuff there are a number of different ways to respond to it. One of them is like skepticism and just say like, okay, neither of us knows. The other is to draw some conclusions about the domain of inquiry itself, and there's no objective fact that we're getting at. It sounds like you want to go there. I want to make the point that it's really, really difficult to determine whether in fact you've actually found instances of epistemic peers, right? So, I mean, we're stipulating for the sake of argument that we've all read the same stuff and we're each equally smart and we've each thought about this just as much. But we can't know from this brief conversation that all of those things are true. And we certainly can't know it about every single one of our philosophical disagreements that bear on this question.
No.
So you can never really, it's not as if, I mean, there's an artificiality to this epistemic peer question. Like, if you had two people who met all of these conditions with regard to some particular philosophical question, well, then maybe we should be skeptics, or then maybe we should be anti-realist about the domain, or maybe we should each change our credences or something. But it's really, really difficult to know in real life
Yeah.
whether an instance of disagreement actually meets those conditions. In fact, there might not even be one. I mean, maybe you and Massimo are able to determine, particular points because you guys have been talking for a long time. But even then, what is evidence, or intuition's evidence, right? If you have different intuitions than me, then we don't have the same evidence.
Right.
Anyway.
I guess I just don't. I think if there's any usefulness to the notion of epistemic peers, it's going to have to be a pretty damn loose notion. Otherwise, like you just pointed out, it becomes such an abstract thought experiment that I'm dubious of its usefulness. To answer any sort of questions that I'd be interested in. A lot of times, typically I usually don't have these kinds of conversations other than with people that I know quite well. So, the vegan thing, I have a department head who that's her entire research agenda is ethical veganism. She's developing an entirely new moral philosophy for the purpose of kind of making what she thinks is the best case for it. I wrote an essay that I published in the Electric Agora where I criticized her work pretty strongly. I've had numerous. I tried to get her to come on Blogging Heads, but she doesn't want to. We're simply never going to agree. And I just can't imagine, given how many of the arguments I've already read and heard, it would just be enormously surprising if some new argument came up. Oh, well, that's it, right? It's just the fact that she and I are completely, totally different, right? Animals play a role in her life that do not in mine, right? She has attitudes and feelings towards her pets that are just completely alien to me, and I have a pet, right?
By the way, I'm also not like an animal lover in the sense like having pets and thinking they're cute. Yeah. Like a lot of vegans are like, they really love their animals, whereas I just think I'm just persuaded that they have a moral standing.
Yeah. But my point is that this isn't itself the reason why I'm skeptical about the subject matter, and I'm inclined towards the idea of sort of widespread indeterminacy with respect to philosophical questions. Listen, I've got 30 other reasons for thinking that. This is just one of those things that when it comes up, it's sort of like, it illustrates it. You know what I mean? It's not proof of it. It's an expression of it in my view. Right.
You've used the word indeterminacy several times, and maybe you can cash that out for me.
Indeterminacy as in the sense of the indeterminacy of translation, right? I mean, the difference between indeterminacy and underdetermination, right? So underdetermination is where you don't have sufficient evidence to choose between competing hypotheses, but that's simply because not all the evidence is in. At some point, there will be a critical mass of evidence that will allow you to choose one hypothesis over another. And indeterminacy is a situation in which there's no amount of evidence that would make it possible to select one among the other, from the other, to distinguish one from the other, to choose one over the other. The famous example of this that is in philosophy, obviously, is from Quine's arguments regarding the indeterminacy of translation, which I largely accept, and I think are correct. And I think have very deep significance for philosophy way beyond the issue of language, because I actually think that the kind of indeterminacy that Quine is talking about is a very, very common feature of most of the major philosophical questions and problems that we have.
Do you think it could be indeterminate whether or not God exists?
Indeterminate whether or not God exists.
Man, you're hesitating. I think this is obvious. No, like God either exists or God does not exist.
I'm not even sure I think that the question is well formed. I mean, I'd have to ask you 50 things about what you mean by God. Do you mean the giant invisible guy? Do you mean the Force? Do you mean, if you ask me, do I think there's a giant invisible man who controls everything and is perfect and all that? My answer is no. I don't.
Okay. How about a being that has the traditional attributes attributed to God? Like does that exist or does it not?
I think there's such a thing as this? No. I don't.
Okay.
I don't think anything supernatural exists.
Okay, well,
But so what? I mean,
okay, well, so what is those aren't? It's not indeterminate if you're able to give a straight no to apparently not only God but all supernatural entities.
I don't agree with that. It is indeterminate whether Gavagai refers to rabbits or rabbit stages. That doesn't stop me from saying it's a rabbit. It simply means that there is no objective, that there is no relevant, significant difference, that everything that is a rabbit is also a set of undertapped rajaparts, is also a set of, it's a matter of what frameworks we're choosing to employ. It's the same thing with with Putnam's micro universe, right? How many balls are there, right? How many objects are there? I mean, the 3 balls. Well, under one system of counting, there's 3. Under another system of counting, there's, 5 or whatever. And, depending on whether you count pairs as objects and all of that. I don't think, if you say to me, how many are there really? My answer is that's not a good question. And I think most philosophical questions are like that. Now, with respect to God, I find that question so uninteresting that I don't spend very much time on it. I always thought the whole thing of giant super invisible beings was just goofy and ridiculous, and I was never once ever tempted to it, to think it. I have difficulty imagining how anybody could think it. But like I said,
uninteresting because you think it's so obviously false.
I just don't think it makes any difference.
It doesn't make any difference whether God exists.
No. And I don't actually think it really makes any difference even to the people who think he does. Christopher Hitchens had this funny line where he said, to some theist he was arguing with, he was like, let me ask you, if you had absolute categorical proof tomorrow that God does not exist, would you all of a sudden start going and breaking into people's houses and murdering and raping and the answer is of course not, right? I mean,
no, he'd probably stop going to church.
But my point is this, that I think that a lot of these sorts of things that we think there's such a great stock in what the answer is. I think if we actually examined our lives and our conduct and the reasons why we do things, we'd find out that probably nothing would change very much if it turned out not to be the case, right? I don't
know if I discovered,
we're very self-deceiving about the reasons we do things and the reasons we think things.
That's certainly true. But I think that if I discovered, one, that God existed, well, I would start taking religion more seriously. I would probably resume praying. I would probably
I wouldn't.
No?
No. Why would I assume that maybe God likes free thinkers? I don't know. I mean, in other words, it's such a wild hypothetical that what winds up happening is people just wind up implicitly channeling all the dogmas and doctrines of the existing religion into whatever sort of either question they're asking or answer that they're giving. This is probably what's wrong with Pascal's wager, right? I mean, it's not just that the statistics are screwed up and that he conflates logical bivalence with statistical probability, but the thing that's most screwed up about it is that the way he characterizes the outcomes, right? Whether you're screwed or whether you're in gravy or whatever, all depends on 1,500 different assumptions about the nature of the entity that it was that you're supposed to be trying to prove the existence of to begin with, right? I just find, look, I understand God talk and philosophical interest in God talk in a pre-modern framework. I don't understand it now. I just don't. I mean, to me, that's like spending years trying to figure out, whether there are fairies and sprites and things like that. It's not interesting. It doesn't matter. It's something that no one more over 6 years old should think, in my opinion, unless you're living 500 years before the scientific revolution. It's just not on any radar of reasonable consideration that I would entertain. I love a lot of philosophers who are religious. So don't right. This does not mean that one of my favorite philosophers is Elizabeth Anscombe, right?
But are you not exhibiting the same kind of certainty that you were decrying earlier in this very
No, because I'm just telling you my own way. I mean, I don't go out and enforce this. I don't hold it against people. I don't use it as a reason to not listen to somebody about some issue that's of interest to me and relevance. Alvin Plantinga is perfectly capable of coming up with any number of things that I would think are interesting and correct, despite the fact that I think in this area the man is insane. We're just very complicated and weird and strange creatures. And I just try to sort of, for the most part, be honest about what I think, accept that people have wildly different views and for me, and that my judgment of what they say and do is just on a case-by-case basis. But no, I don't. I'm not the sort of person that thinks that, because you do this one thing that I think is batshit crazy, that taints everything you think and everything you believe, everything you do. I've just never been like that. And like I said, some of my favorite philosophers are religious. There's nothing about my views about religion that are a reason why I can't think that Elizabeth Anscombe made one of the strongest critiques of modern moral philosophy that's ever been made, right? Or the same with Alistair McIntyre. So I'm inclined to be very generous in that way. I don't have it, let's distinguish between, to express yourself fully and completely and confidently on the one hand. Let's distinguish that from having healthy skepticism about ultimately what's true, right? Or what even can be true or false. Because look, if these things are generally indeterminate, then a lot of our battles are battles of wills, right? They're not battles over truths. They're battles of wills.
Yeah. So this is the thing actually, could I take a break for a minute? Maybe.
Yeah.
Okay?
Let me pause the recording.
Okay. Yeah. So I'm wondering if you can connect your conception of philosophy, where many of these questions turn out to be just indeterminate, with this humility that you advocate. I'm not sure I see a connection between the two. And in fact, this is something undergrads think about moral relativism, that moral relativism is the same thing as tolerance, right? But then you think, no, like if moral relativism is true and my culture says I need to just impose my will on every other culture, well, then why not? What's to constrain that? So I just put that out there as a way to say, I'm not sure how your notion of these questions being indeterminate connects with your personal philosophy of humility with regard to these questions.
Well, as I said before, I don't think that just the disagreement among peers, let's just do this to be clear that we're speaking pretty colloquially about it, is proof of the indeterminacy. I think it's an expression of it. I think it's an articulation of the indeterminacy. In terms of the relationship of the indeterminacy to what I'm calling humility, I guess the relationship that I see is that it's sort of related to what I just said to you, right? I don't see any good reasons for believing in supernatural entities. Somebody else does. What exactly am I gonna do about that, right? I guess one thing I could do is sort of persecute him to the ends of the earth. I have no reason or desire or interest to do that. Partly because I don't think anything ultimately is at stake, in any very profound sense. Maybe it would lead me to not take as credible anything else he says, on the grounds that if he's witless enough to believe this, then, why should I trust anything else the man says? But I don't expect people to be consistent in that way. I just have so many examples of people who are completely witless in one area and absolutely brilliant in another, right?
Sure.
And so I guess what I ask myself is, okay, I'm not a Platonist. I'm not a rationalist. I don't expect that, there's a true answer that's sitting there in heaven, and that, when I get to heaven, I'm going to see what it is and it's going to matter and all that. I guess I just see different people with very different frames of reference, very different perspectives, most of whom I can probably learn something interesting from. And I sort of proceed on that basis.
Right. So I'm not alleging any kind of inconsistency here. I'm just saying it seems like your disposition to be humble and to want to promote tolerance with regard to these questions seems totally independent of this view about the indeterminacy of philosophical questions. It's not like the one follows from the other or
Well, yes. I mean, there's entirely prudential reasons. Look, this is my arguments ultimately for, liberalism. They're all prudential, right? Because there's a gazillion problems with liberal theory, right? I mean, you can criticize the conception of the citizen as being too abstract. You can criticize the idea of rational self-interest. I mean, you can do all that stuff, right? But at the end of the day, I don't see any other arrangement by which large heterogeneous groups of people can live to each other without knifing each other to death. And so ultimately, it's pragmatic. I mean, look, I could behave like some of my colleagues in philosophy and persecute my colleagues across the landscape and try to get them fired from their jobs for disagreeing with me about things that I think are true and important and, and all that. But that's where partly I think it's not so much that the indeterminacy directly is responsible for the humility. Humility is justifiable on entirely prudential grounds, in my opinion. But I do think that reflecting on the indeterminacy it provides a kind of a sort of an after the fact rational reconstruction of why not only is it prudential to be tolerant, but also it's probably truthful to be tolerant, because you can be as confident as you like, but you could still be dead wrong, right? And unlike in chemistry, right, there's obviously not that kind of objective fact of the matter that anyone is ever going to be confirmed in the way that experimental results can confirm things in the sciences. Although even, of course, in the sciences, things get overturned periodically, often completely paradigm changing. But in philosophy, just to me, that seems to be its dominant character rather than sort of, a rarity. And so, yeah, I do think that the indeterminacy, when one is trying to get a sort of a rational reconstruction of the reason for being humble, one reason is because unlike in chemistry, this dispute is not going to be resolved. There's no experimental result that's going to resolve this dispute, right? There were metaphysical realists and anti-realists in 500 BC. There are metaphysical realists and anti-realists now. It's just hubris, borderline stupid, to now think, oh, well, but in 50 years, we'll finally get it, right? I mean, I believe that in 50 years, we might find out what this chemical bond is, because there really is a chemical bond. But realism and anti-realism, metaphysical, is more attitudinal. It's about constructing certain pictures of the world that have certain advantages and certain disadvantages depending upon what your interests are in the inquiry. Same thing with internalism and externalism and justification. If you're really interested in the normative dimension of justification, you probably don't want to be an externalist. If you're more concerned with, getting tied up in Gettier cases, then you probably are going to want to be an externalist. I mean, but if you ask me, well, what is it really? My answer is it's not that kind of thing. It's nothing really. Right. All right. So nothing really.
I wondered to what extent we were going to get into some of the political issues.
Sure.
But now, with the way the conversation has gone, I guess it's fair to say, like, we share a lot of the same concerns about what's going on with the discipline. But what I want to know now is, it seems like our motivations might not be the same. I think that I believe in moral truth. I think that philosophy is a tool to help us discover it.
Before you start though, why don't you be explicit about what we're talking about? When you say we share common concerns about the discipline, different motives, be explicit.
The encroachment of activism in scholarship. That's something that I think we're both worried about.
Yes.
Okay. before we go into the details of that, because we could both be expressing our concern about that for some time. I'm just not quite sure what motivates your concern about that. I know what motivates my concern about this is I think that there's more truth. I think that philosophy is an imperfect tool of helping us discover it. So that's why I worry about philosophy being corrupted. But if you have such a pessimistic view of philosophy, you're not even sure there's a loose group resemblance between its various parts, that sort of thing. I'm not sure why you'd be as worried about its corruption, or maybe it's not. Maybe it's just individual acts against people that you're worried about.
Yeah, I'm not really worried about corruption. In the abstract, I'm worried about. I mean, my problem with what I've been calling the woke brigade in philosophy are doing is similar to sort of why you don't shit in your own pool, right? I mean, we're all going to have to swim in this pool. If you turn it into such a vicious, backstabbing, cutthroat, brutal environment, no one's going to be able to swim. It's going to just die. There's going to be no pool. They're going to close the pool, right? Just going to close the pool. Not to mention the fact that as an entirely separate, I don't need any philosophy to tell me this. You don't behave this way in a civil society, right? You don't go after people's livelihood. You don't go after people's reputation in this way. You don't slander and smear and do that sort of thing if you want to be able to all live together. I mean, again, but my reasons for thinking this are entirely prudential. These people seem to be under some sort of bizarre misimpression that not only can they win, but they can stay in power in perpetuity. And I don't know how many times we need to elect Donald Trumps to make them see that's not the case. Right? Right? They keep doing this. You're going to get somebody you'd wish you could have Trump back, right? You keep acting like this. And so I just think it's stupid in the way of sort of like shitting in your pool is stupid, and ill-advised and a bad idea. But I don't really care that much that they're wrong, right? Take any of these issues, I care about practical outcomes. So if you tell me that because of your theory, we're now no longer going to maintain sex segregated intimate spaces so that women can have privacy when they're undressed and stuff, I do care about that, right? Right. But not because of some philosophical reason. I just care about that because, I care about women, right? I mean, I have a wife, I have a daughter, I have a mother, I'm invested, right? I'm personally invested. I have stake in it.
But you shouldn't have to have stake in it to have an opinion about it. I mean, I
don't think you should have to have a stake in it, but I am somewhat suspicious of people that have no stake in things and are just exercised in a manner that I don't understand how you could be unless you did, right? I mean, I just don't get that level of emotional investment in something you have no stake in. I don't understand it personally.
Right. Number of things to say about this. Yeah. As far as what you said about certainty, I completely agree that in as much as you think that epistemic humility is a valuable thing, and a valuable thing not just in philosophy but generally, you should be alarmed about some of these trends, which are not limited to philosophy but have certainly influenced it. I got to tell you this one anecdote about political bias that I think you'll find amusing, because I think that this illustrates something really sinister, I think, in academia. So this would have been like 3 or 4 years ago. I was doing this teaching certificate thing when I was a grad student at Boulder, which is not in the philosophy department. This is just interdepartmental thing. And there was this one exercise where we were given a page of, it was a children's encyclopedia from either Argentina or Brazil, where about the United States. And we were supposed to write one sentence that best encapsulated what was on that page. And it was either in Portuguese or Spanish, I don't remember, but there were a few pictures. And so basically we were trying to summarize what our picture of the United States was based on what the pictures in front of us. And here were the pictures. There was a picture of the World Trade Center. Obviously, this was before 9/11, this textbook. There was a picture of the Grand Canyon. There's a picture of the Statue of Liberty. I think there was a small picture of the Golden Gate Bridge. And then there was a picture of a kid dressed up as a cowboy with like cap guns, and then some people playing football. So those were the images. And we were supposed to come up with one sentence to describe what we would think of the United States based on this page.
Interesting. Okay.
So I came up, I mean, it was so bland. I had a hard time thinking of anything. I said something like America's a big place full of, rugged people, maybe something like that. Other people, another one of the groups, the sentence they came up with was the United States is a country obsessed with power and domination. And I just thought, how did you see that in these images? I was confused. Did they get a different picture than I got? And this was part of the exercise, but no, it was exactly the same thing. And they inferred, and I said, wait, this isn't supposed to be your prior view. You're supposed to base this on the information in front of you. And they're like, yeah, that's right. And I said, well,
everybody's bringing their prior view to it, right?
I know.
It's not avoidable.
I know. It's unavoidable to some degree. But then I asked them, I said, okay, so what in this page gives you the impression that America is obsessed with power and domination? And they pointed to the kid with the cowboy outfit, and they said, he's got an aggressive stance, and he's pointing one of the toy guns at the camera, and it's really threatening. And I just thought, and then somebody else came up with the sentence, the United States lacks cultural diversity. And it's like, there's only one visible person in this entire set of photos. How can you? But anyway, the thing that I found so alarming about this was that, and I think these students, I was the only philosopher there. There were some people from literature, so a couple of sociologists, a couple of people from education, but they all were under the impression that they were just responding to the evidence in front of them and not projecting what they already thought onto whatever was given them. You give them a Rorschach test and they're like, every single blob is going to look like patriarchy or something.
Listen, I agree with you. I mean, but what specifically to do with philosophy are you getting at? I mean, you asked me, you said, I suspect we have similar worries about philosophy, but now you said I'm starting to wonder about our differing motivations.
Yeah.
So I told you my motivations, which indeed are different from yours. Is this supposed to illustrate something about the difference between us in terms of, are you raising this because you want to suggest that I should be more concerned not just about sort of mundane prudential things, but about whether their views are true or?
Well, yeah, I mean, I would hope that one thing that philosophy would help people be able to do is to sort of transcend their priors. You're not just projecting your priors on whatever is in front of you. You can allow your mind to snag on some kind of independent reality and to change your views a little bit. And, you can be a little bit more optimistic about reason if you consider that changing your view doesn't mean I've gone from being an atheist today to a theist. It doesn't have to be that. But I think if you change your priors a little bit in response to new evidence, that itself is progress. And I think our discipline can be one that helps people do that helps people, not completely throw their priors out the window, because that's impossible, but to not let them be your destiny, to respond to new information, to recognize the implications of new information, and not just to come to the table with one set of views and just keep up the Nicholas Rescher escalation or the arms race. I think that's something our discipline can do. And that's something I'm worried about being lost with all of this, and being lost with the instrumentalization of philosophy. And there's a right-wing version of this. The right-wing version of this is it's all about dollars and cents, and it's all about the economy and all of this.
Yeah.
And then the left-wing version is philosophy is, should be mobilized towards activism, and we're going to use the toolkit to undermine structures of oppression as we see them. But I think there isn't a value of itself to enable people to reflect on their priors and to come to new conclusions and to recognize new evidence for what it is, rather than just seeking to enforce what they are.
I don't disagree with virtually any of that. I mean, if you ask me, well, what's valuable about philosophy? Because we didn't really talk about what's valuable about it. We only talked about sort of what it is. But I mean, if you ask me what I think is valuable about philosophy, certainly, I would list high up the development of the capacity to engage in critical self-examination. But I don't see why the value of that has to be tied to any kind of realism about the subject areas of philosophy. In other words, it's a good thing. One of the reasons it's a good thing to critically examine your own attitudes and priors is to appreciate the very different attitudes and priors that other people have, and to realize, they have their own reasons for those, right? The fact that I can critically examine mine makes it easier for me to understand how somebody else could have other ones, which then means that hopefully will translate into me being able to live a little better with people with whom I don't agree. I mean, look, to me, at the end of the day, my ultimate reason for embracing so strongly the liberal consensus is that either there isn't an independent fact of the matter regarding the good, or you're never going to be able to conclusively demonstrate what it is. It doesn't really matter. Either way, the result is the same. We all have to live with each other. Are we going to make it a bloody knife fight, or are we going to make it relatively pleasant experience? And unless you assume that your side is going to win and remain in power in perpetuity, which I think is an incredibly stupid, naive, and ignorant thing to think, then we should probably just try to live with each other. And one way to make that a lot easier is to at least understand that people who disagree with you have their own reasons, just like you do, right? And I do think that being able to critically examine your own views helps make that a lot easier, right? But I don't think that it requires there to be any independent fact of the matter or realism about any of these subjects. It's just a good idea, just for the sake of having the 80 or so years we get to be around be pleasant and productive and not horrible, right?
Yeah, I suppose I agree with your prudential.
And to me, that's enough. For some people, that's not enough. Yeah. For me, that's enough. It's not enough for you, probably. And I'm not trying to convince you, by the way.
I suppose that's right. I'm worried about even for you, it can't just be a matter of self-interest, right? There's got to be some kind of principle here. We ought to all get along. That sounds an awful lot like an ethical principle you're appealing to here.
Well, I don't know. Is it? Do I need a principle to explain why I prefer to have a peaceful, calm life in harmony with my neighbors than to be in constant war and fear for my livelihood, my well-being, and all of that? Do I really need a principle to explain that?
Well, there are preferences and there are preferences, right? There's a preference for coffee rather than tea, but a preference for a peaceful and calm life. That seems like a rational preference. Not that the other one's irrational, but it's just sort of non-rational. least that's how I.
That's sort of Kant's distinction between judgments of mere agreeability, which are entirely subjective and are not matters of dispute, and then judgments of beauty, which he thinks imply the expectation of agreement from other people. I guess maybe listen, I am not suggesting that my view on this is a predominant one or that most people would agree with it. I'm just simply trying to be as honest as I can in answering you. I guess I'm getting to the point now, the older and older I get, that I'm realizing the absolute futility of ever expecting widespread significant agreement with respect to anything really fundamental, which is exactly what the liberal consensus is based upon, right? You think about Rawls, right? It's predicated on the assumption that we are never going to accept on a common view of the good. And then ask, okay, if we can't, then how are we going to live? And the way we live is to just give each other a lot of space, right? We're going to live roughly in the manner described by John Stuart Mill on Liberty. Now, to me, that's entirely procedural. I don't know that requires a tremendous number of principles. It just means that, better to get along than to be in a constant knife fight, right?
Yeah.
See, I worry about lofty aims. You worry about my low ambition. I worry about. I'm always most worried by the people who have the loftiest aims. They scare me the most. I would give me a room full of middling, unprincipled, uncertain people any day.
Moral zealotry is really dangerous, and
I'm terrified of people's rightness. I'm terrified of their nobility. I'm terrified of just. I'd rather just deal with average, fallible people, right? Who have no great pretensions to justice or anything else. I don't like moral crusades. I don't even like all of this. I've talked to Massimo about this. I'm really, and some of the people on the site get very angry at me for this. I am very, very skeptical of all of these efforts at moral and characterological self-improvement under the guidance of all these various theories, whether it's mindfulness or I just find all of it vaguely creepy, scary, unnatural. I kind of agree with Hume that there's a kind of thinking that is appropriate and makes sense in the study. But if you keep doing that when you walk outside, then you become a very strange person, and one that I probably would stay away from. You know what I mean? I think in other words, so I'm an anti-realist in the study, but I don't act as if there aren't trees, right? You know what I mean? I think philosophers try to bring way too much, and Massimo completely disagrees with this because Massimo wants to go back to the ancient Greek notion where philosophy and life are entirely integrated. I don't like the results.
Be more like Massimo on that. I think I don't like the idea of Hume's bi-perspectival perspective on philosophy, because then what's the point? Like, why go into the study? What's the point of it to begin with?
Because it's damned interesting. Because it does. See, it's funny. This is going to seem random, but it relates to the vegan thing, right? So one of the things that people often say to me when they're making these vegan arguments is, and actually it reminds me a little bit of Pascal's wager, how little you have to give up to save the world an enormous amount of suffering. After all, how could you, it's just, tastiness, right? I don't downplay tastiness. I think that's one of the most important things there is, right? I have to a certain extent, very pessimistic, fatalistic view about life. I think that an awful lot of all of this stuff just is born out of initial, catastrophically unrealistic and mistaken expectations, right? To my mind, what life primarily is suffering. That is not alterable. That is the condition of things. And that remains true even if one is extraordinarily lucky and wealthy and all of that sort of stuff. I mean, I've come from a very wealthy family. I don't suffer nearly as much as a bazillion other people do. And yet I had, spent the most nightmarish 6 weeks of my life this spring when my father was in intensive care and I thought he was going to die. Right. To me, the expectation is suffering that is unavoidable. And so all of these little things that people want to minimize, that philosophers love to minimize, to me, that's the whole freaking point. So yeah, I mean, I would place a much higher value on probably the things that you would think are very small, right? And I would place a much smaller value on the things that you think are tremendously important. I just don't. To me, the mundanities are the whole point. And the very deep thinking and all of that is stuff that some people will have the luxury to do sometimes, and it's enjoyable. But I just think it's self-delusional to think that it's tapping into some deep, that we're doing on the sort of meaning side what the physicists are doing on the fundamental nature of the material world side, right? I just don't think that.
No, I don't think there's a very tight analogy there. But look, I like I said at the beginning, there are some people for whom philosophy is studying interesting puzzles. But for me, if I didn't think that there was some important moral truth here to be discovered, some truth that's relevant to life outside the study, I would not be investing this kind of time into it. Right? I mean, I do enjoy it, but that's not why I take myself to be motivated. And perhaps there's some confabulation going on. Perhaps I'm just. Would you say the same thing about?
Would you say the same thing about arts or literature or music?
Yeah, I think those. I think beauty is a real thing. I think beauty is important.
See, that's not. I don't mean that. What I mean is more that if there wasn't something to art, music, and literature beyond the enjoyment and the really interesting experiences that come out of their consumption, would they be in some sense diminished for it? See, I don't think so.
I guess I'm not sure what beyond it is you're talking about. Like what, doing studies that
the same thing that seems to be required. So you just said, if all that there was to philosophy was to have interesting experiences and to pursue and pose interesting questions, then I wouldn't be putting that much into it. And what I guess I'm asking is, I put an enormous amount of my time and energy into the consumption of music and literature and arts, and I'm wondering whether, and I don't think that they have that sort of significance beyond that. And that to me is more than is still not wouldn't be a reason to not pursue them to the extent that I do. I'm just wondering whether you feel that way in general, or whether it's just about philosophy that you feel that way.
No, that's fair. I guess no. I mean, I listen to music for enjoyment, but I just don't take that to be mostly what I'm doing in philosophy, and perhaps I'm deluded in that. But I don't take that. I'm
suggesting no such thing. I'm simply asking.
Yeah.
I am well aware that mine is a very probably eccentric way of thinking about this, certainly for philosophers. Now, look, I don't want to underplay too much. I mean, look, I do think philosophy does produce things of importance. I think that the tool set you learn to use is very useful because it can be employed in a lot of places, not just with respect to philosophical questions. So I do think that people who do philosophy get better at doing almost everything else that involves the mind, right? So it has instrumental value in that regard, and it's not negligible in my view. I also do think that what you said before, I do think that philosophy does help a person to become skilled in critical self-examination, which I do believe is essential to being able to live together in harmony and peace, given that either the fact of the matter is indeterminate, or we're not going to ever have confirmation that we found it, right? Doesn't matter which. But the more I critically examine myself, the better I'm probably going to appreciate other people's reasons for having different views and living different ways that will then make me able to tolerate better people's experiments in living, as Mill would put it, right? So I do think that those are valuable, very valuable skills, right? But if you ask me, do I think that philosophy, does philosophy, if there isn't a fact of the matter about what ultimate objective morality consists of, is it worth studying ethics? My answer is absolutely. And as a matter of fact, that would be the thing I was least interested in about it.
'Cause I'm not that interested in theology because I don't think that there is a God. And if I didn't think there were ethical truths, I wouldn't be that interested in studying ethics.
I find theology fascinating. As a matter of fact, that's probably the bulk of what I watch on YouTube are disputes between theologians, and I never once believed it once in my entire life.
We do have different motivations.
Let me try to defend myself in one more way and see what you think of this, and then we should probably wrap up. I hope that we're going to do more of these because I get the sense that we have probably a lot of things we could talk about, and I would love to talk to you about metaethics. Look, I'm going to go back to the thing with my father's near death. So my father is 91. He's very old. And he started falling and hallucinating. This was back in the spring of this year. And turned out he had a lung infection, probably from aspirating food, because my father likes to talk while he eats. So he was in there he was in the ICU, then he was in the hospital for 3 weeks, then he had 3 more weeks in rehab. It was terrible, it was brutal, it was a punishing experience. I think I'm still kind of traumatized by it. I'm seeing a therapist because of it. It was a very, very harsh experience. When he came out, my instinct was I wanted to sort of make arrangements so that there would be constant supervision, there would be constant support, there would be constant help, because he insists on staying at home and not moving into a managed environment. And he absolutely would resist any efforts. Once I realized there's no way to make a senior's home equivalent to a managed environment. There's no way to do it. Even with my parents' money, they can hire as many people as they want. It's just simply not possible, right? And for a while, I was extremely angry. And I told him, I had a sort of a falling, I had sort of like a conflict with him, a confrontation with him about this. And he asked me the following. He said, I'm 91. He said, what the hell is the point of me staying alive longer if I'm not going to do what I want? What the hell's the point of it? Right? And I realized he's absolutely right. Now, that it constitutes a burden. The only thing that I thought was a bit rather myopic was that it wasn't really occurring to him how this was affecting other people, right?
Sure.
Like me and my daughter and all of that. But I've had to deal with a teenager who is much more morally objectivist and realist than you are, who is as furious as her grandfather. You know how teenagers are. Teenagers are very righteous, right? She's furious at her grandfather. If he really loved me, he wouldn't be doing this. Doesn't he know how worried I am? And what I told her was, I said, you know something? I said, I have no idea how I'm going to react and how I'm going to behave when death is literally this close to my face. I have no idea. So my inclination is just to be completely, utterly charitable. And I can afford to be, right? And so can you, I told her, right? This is a long-winded way of answering what you, trying to justify myself a little more to you. Look, at the end of the day, we get to live X amount of years. Thank God, hopefully, we're not struggling just to survive. if our existential needs have been met, if there's no war, if there's no famine, then for God's sake, I'm going to enjoy what I eat. I'm going to enjoy the artworks, the stuff that I like to read and look at. I'm going to do the work that I find personally interesting and fulfilling. And I don't see why I require any more motivation than that. Right? I am not in an existential struggle for my survival. And I think it's unseemly to pretend like I am, right? To act like someone who is. And I feel like all of these people, these super intense people, are acting the way I would expect you to act if you lived in fucking Darfur, all right? Not in the United States. In some cushy digs in a university department, right? And so to me, I think all these little things, the little pleasures, to me, I think that's the whole point. That's the reason why people want to become unpoor. So they can do those freaking things. So I don't see why we who aren't freaking poor would diminish all the simple little pleasures and trivialities and mundanities that people who are in desperate straits are desperately trying to attain, right? I almost feel like we've got it so good that we have to try to invent problems.
Yeah, I get that. I get that.
That's my attitude, so to speak. And that's how I would defend it.
I suppose my outlook in philosophy, it's clearly different than yours. We have overlapping concerns about some of these practical things. But for me, it wasn't just what's convenient, how do I live, in deciding, do I bear witness to the prophecy of Joseph Smith or not? This is like, is this true or not? Am I living according to a true principle? Am I living with integrity or not? And that to me is central to what philosophy is, trying to live with integrity with regard to these ultimate questions in a world full of uncertainty. And I think you can do it without being a zealot. In fact, I think the people who are behaving in a way that's overzealous, they're suffering from a lack of self-examination or something like that. I don't think that the way to make philosophy, more humble and honest is to divorce it from the commitment to moral principle or something like that. At least, I guess that's how my perspective differs from yours in this.
Yeah. Yeah. And look, I mean, you entered into philosophy from the frame of reference of profound existential crisis, right? One of the best things about the essay, and it's going to be linked to so the audience will know, Spencer is a very good writer. And one of the things about the essay is I actually found it quite devastating, part of it, to read. Because it's so well written and because what it describes is a very young person who clearly is in anguish, right? And I thought it was very effective in that regard. You came to philosophy from such a point of profound consciousness that it doesn't surprise me at all that that's in a sense the template upon which you're building your philosophical career. You have to understand, I came to philosophy from luxury and comfort against the backdrop of such utter total catastrophe, right? And what I mean is I come from a family of Holocaust survivors. My mother was in a concentration camp. It was in Bergen-Belsen. You can count my entire living family on like a hand and a half, right? I mean, there literally are none of us left because they were almost all gassed, right? And so I am so profoundly aware of just how few problems I have, real ones. And I'm so profoundly aware of what genuine total catastrophe, human catastrophe and disaster look like, that I am just very, very skittish about adopting any sort of overly grandiose posture with respect to any sort of problem that I could devise or imagine, right? And so I came to philosophy from the position of my parents did the unbelievable thing, and that is surviving the Nazis and building up enough wealth to give a child an incredible life in one of the nicest parts of the United States. Send him to one of the best colleges. He can do whatever he wants. Damn it, I'm going to take that opportunity, right? And I'm going to do what I want, and I'm going to enjoy it, and I'm going to lead an interesting life and not find new reasons to martyr myself so that I can look like I'm taking the world seriously. I don't need to look like I'm taking the world seriously. I know very well. All I need to do is talk to my mother to find out how fucking serious the world can be. And I think it would be unseemly of me. So look, in that sense, and here's a perfect example of where the temperament, I think, overwhelms, even if there is an objective reality, it overwhelms it, right? You and I should do philosophy differently. It would be unseemly, in my view, for me to approach philosophy the way you do, because I'm not coming from your background, right? I'm not coming from the place you came from, right? I came to philosophy from the standpoint of the incredible luxury and gift of being able to do whatever I want and not having to earn a lot of money because my parents already had made all the money. And so I went, that's how I approach it. I don't think you could have approached it any other way, given how you came to it. I'll be interested to see 30 years from now if you're still like this. But how would you know? I mean, I don't know how old. I'm 52. How old are you?
34.
Right. So 34. If we'd had this conversation when I was 34, would have been a very different conversation. Would have been an even different conversation when I was in my 20s. And so it'll be interesting to see, where you develop. But I mean, I understand where you're coming from makes perfect sense to me. And it makes equally perfect sense why I could never come to it that way. I also come out of a religious tradition that just doesn't require the kinds of commitments and certitudes and, that the tradition you come from does. So I don't know if that makes any sense, but
it makes sense. Let's not let this be our last conversation.
No, absolutely. I would like to in the future talk about specific things. So like metaethics and the areas that you're working in are areas I'm very interested in. And I suspect that we disagree in interesting ways that would make for very good discussions. So anyway, Spencer, thank you so much. And to the audience, Spencer will be back by his own. You heard him say it. And so we will have more dialogues in the future. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Dan.
All right, take care.